What if I told you that I lived half a century in silence, not because I didn't want to speak, but because they taught me that speaking was a sin? What if I confessed that the hands that held the Bible were the same hands that left bruises on my body? What if I admitted that the man who preached about love every Sunday would turn into a stranger, with cold eyes and fists full of rage the moment the congregation turned their backs? My name is Helena Duarte. I'm 82 years old, and I was born in a small village in the highlands of Oaxaca, Mexico. A quiet place, with dirt streets and early church bells. The kind of place where everyone knows your name, but no one dares to know your story. I grew up with fear disguised as obedience. They taught me to lower my head, to smile even when it hurt, to pray instead of asking questions, to stay silent, even when my soul screamed. I met Reuben when I was 19. He was a newly ordained pastor, handsome, polite, charismatic, the kind of man mothers pointed out to their daughters with pride. He approached me one afternoon after service. He said he admired my modesty, my discreet eyes, my submissive spirit. At the time, I thought that was love. In less than 6 months, we were married. The wedding was simple, but full of prayers. My mother cried with emotion. The women at church gave me advice I didn't understand at the time. Be patient, pray hard, and never deny your husband. That's where the devil gets in. I didn't understand, not then. The first time Reuben raised his voice at me, I was pregnant. He said dinner was cold, that I wasn't paying enough attention, that I needed to learn what being a wife of God's man really meant. He didn't hit me that day, but he threw the plate against the wall, and he quoted a verse after. The foolish woman tears her house down with her own hands. I felt ashamed, not of him, but of myself, because he had managed to convince me that I was the problem, and that pattern repeated itself for years. Screams disguised as corrections, threats hidden behind verses, silence enforced as spiritual discipline. We had for children Isaiah, Elias, Magdalena, and little Samuel. Each one brought joy to my heart, but also more chains to my feet, because every time I thought of leaving, I looked at their faces, and I convinced myself that enduring was better than breaking up a Christian home. Besides, who would believe me? Reuben was adored by the church. He was called a man of wisdom, a pillar, anointed. And I was just Helena, the quiet, obedient, absent-minded wife who always arrived early and left late. The one who led the women's ministry, but never spoke about her own life. The one who smiled with her lips, but had no light left in her eyes. There were nights when I wanted to scream, but I would bite my tongue and cry silently in the bathroom so the children wouldn't hear. Because I didn't want them to hate their father. Because I didn't want them to see me as weak. Because I didn't know how to explain that the same man who prayed over them was the same man who crushed my voice every night. I tried talking to the pastor's wife once. She looked me in the eye and said, "You must be doing something wrong. He wouldn't act that way without a reason." I never tried again. Over time, I disappeared into the routines, the prayers, the cooking, the meetings, the laundry. I existed, but I didn't live until one day Magdalena, my daughter, came home from school and asked, "Mom, does God get mad when someone yells at us?" That question broke me because I realized I had been teaching my children that pain was normal, that silence was noble, that enduring abuse was a virtue. And that day, I looked at myself in the mirror, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back. She wasn't Helena. She was a shadow. And I promised myself something. Before I died, I would become me again. If this story is reaching your heart, if something in you stirred while reading, leave a comment below saying, "I also deserve to be free." Subscribe to this channel to follow this real story of pain, faith, and survival. And don't forget to like this video if you believe no woman should be silenced in the name of religion. Because silence isn't sacred. Truth is. The first time Reuben touched me with violence, it wasn't with a slap. It wasn't a punch. It was a grip, a firm, icy grip on my arm while we were leaving the church. We had just finished a prayer service. People were smiling, greeting each other. Someone had brought sweet bread, and the children were laughing in the hallway. Reuben looked at me and said, "You embarrassed me today." I didn't understand. I had only forgotten to bring the printed program for the next women's meeting. But for him, that was reason enough. He grabbed my arm and squeezed hard. Not in public, oh no. Reuben was smart. He waited until we were in the back hallway, near the storage room. "You will learn to honor your role, Helena," he hissed. "You are the reflection of my ministry, and I will not have a wife who makes me look like a fool." That night, my arm turned purple, but I didn't cover it with makeup. I covered it with shame. That shame became my companion. It sat next to me during dinners. It held my hand during services. It whispered to me when I prayed, "It's your fault. You provoke him." I tried to be better, more obedient, more punctual, more invisible. But nothing was enough. Reuben always found a reason. The soup was too salty. The children were too loud. My hair was messy. I spoke too softly. I laughed too much. Everything about me was wrong in his eyes. Everything. And every time he lost his temper, he followed it with a verse. "A woman must submit to her husband as unto the Lord." The head of every woman is the man. Better to live in a corner of the roof than with a quarrelsome wife. He weaponized scripture. He twisted it like a rope around my throat until I believed it. I started to think that perhaps God wanted me to suffer, that this was my cross, that my tears were part of some divine plan to purify my soul. And when I couldn't take it anymore, I prayed harder. I fasted. I cried out to God in the middle of the night. I begged him to change Reuben, to restore our home, to bring peace. But peace never came. What came instead were more disciplinary moments, like the time he slapped me because I disagreed with a decision in the women's group, or the time he locked me in the bedroom for 3 hours because I asked why he had stayed out so late. No one ever knew. I smiled on Sundays, led worship on Wednesdays, baked cookies for the youth on Fridays, and on the inside, I was crumbling. I used to love music. Before marriage, I would hum as I swept, sing softly while cooking, lose myself in melodies during long walks. But little by little, I stopped. Because Reuben said it was worldly. Because he mocked my voice. Because he once said, "You think your little songs will save you from hell." So I silenced even my own melodies. My mother came to visit once, years after the wedding. She looked at me and said, "You look pale, Hadja. Are you eating well?" I nodded. I lied. Because how do you tell your mother that the man who lays hands on you at church also lays hands on you at home? In a different way, she left me a rosary, just in case. She whispered. I never used it, but I kept it, like a secret. Lifeline to a God I wasn't sure still saw me. Then came the pregnancy with Samuel, my 4th child, the one I didn't plan, the one I feared wouldn't survive the chaos. I was weak, emotionally broken, physically drained. Reuben didn't stop, even with my swollen belly, even with the doctor's warnings. Once, during an argument about the laundry, he pushed me. I fell and felt a pain in my abdomen that didn't let me breathe. But I said nothing, because if I went to the hospital, they would ask questions, and I didn't know how to answer without destroying the image he had built. Samuel was born underweight. He didn't cry much, and for years, I wondered if that silence came from the womb, from me, from the fear I carried while he was inside me. I used to stay awake at night, watching all 4 children sleep, their tiny chests rising and falling, and I would whisper, "Forgive me, I'm trying." They never heard, but I hoped God did. The church grew. Reuben became more respected. They invited him to conferences. He mentored young pastors. People called me blessed, but I felt like a ghost in my own skin. Until one day, Elias, my 2nd son, asked me, "Mom, does Dad love you?" I froze. He was only 10. But he had seen too much. He had heard things no child should hear. He had connected dots I tried so hard to erase. And that night, as I tucked him in, I said, God loves us, and that's what matters. But even I didn't believe it anymore, because if God truly loved me, why did he let this continue? Why was my prison painted in holy colors? Why did my cries echo back in silence? That question haunted me every morning, every night, until it became the question that would one day set me free. When you grow up in church, you learn quickly what should never be spoken aloud. You learn that there are things whispered in bathrooms, things you never bring up in prayer circles, things you cover with long sleeves, long skirts, and longer silences. And the biggest of those things is abuse. Not abuse by a stranger, not abuse by an outsider, but abuse committed by those who stand at the pulpit, by those who lead worship, by those who begin every sentence with God says. I learned to fear God not because he was just, but because I believed he was watching me suffer and doing nothing. The church was our second home. We were there nearly every day. Reuben was respected, admired, and feared all at once. He spoke with authority. People cried during his sermons. He laid hands on the sick. He counseled couples. He baptized dozens. And I stood beside him like a silent statue. The other women admired me. They said I was so spiritual, so dedicated, so obedient. I wanted to scream, I'm not obedient. I'm trapped. But I smiled, because that's what a good pastor's wife does. She smiles. She organizes potlucks. She prays for others. She never, ever tells the truth. I remember one Sunday after service. We were in the fellowship hall. I had a small bruise on my cheekbone, barely visible. Reuben had pushed me the night before, said I was speaking too freely. During dinner with another couple, I had laughed too much. That was my sin. That morning, I wore extra powder, but the bruise peeked through. Sister Ruth noticed. She leaned close and said quietly, "Rough morning with the kids." I nodded. She smiled and gave me a motherly pat. But I saw it in her eyes. She knew. She knew. And she didn't ask. That was the pattern. People knew. The elders, the women's ministry, even the youth pastor once saw Reuben grab my arm too hard in the parking lot. But no one said anything, because Reuben was anointed, because Reuben had a calling, because we don't talk about personal matters publicly. We take them to God. I tried to take it to God so many times. I would kneel in the sanctuary after everyone left, my hands trembling, my stomach turning, and I would whisper, "Lord, if I'm the problem, change me. If he's the problem, stop him. But please, don't let my children grow up thinking this is love." There was never an answer, just the echo of my breath and the flickering of the altar candles. I remember a women's conference we hosted one year. I was asked to speak about the role of the godly wife. I stood on stage, looked out at the sea of faces, some hopeful, some tired, some broken, and I lied. I told them about submission, about sacrifice, about spiritual alignment in marriage. I quoted verses I no longer believed, because I knew that if I said what I really felt, if I told them that obedience can kill you slowly, I would be destroyed. After the conference, a young woman approached me, barely 20, eyes wide, hopeful. She said, "I want to be a wife like you." I almost cried, because all I could think was, "No, Mija, you don't." Over the years, I tried to open up, cautiously, to other pastors' wives, to close friends, but the response was always the same. You must be patient. Men of God carry a heavy burden. They need our support. Don't let the enemy use your pain to divide the church. I began to think I was the enemy, that every time I wanted to scream, it was Satan tempting me, that every tear was weakness, that every thought of escape was rebellion. One night, after a particularly violent argument, I went to the kitchen and sat in the dark. I held a knife in my hand, not to use it, not on anyone, just to feel something cold, something real, something I could control. I sat there for an hour, my heart numb, my thoughts racing, and then a Samuel, my youngest, came in. He was 6. He rubbed his eyes and said, "Mom, why are you crying?" I hadn't realized I was. I dropped the knife, held him tight, and cried like a child. That moment stayed with me, because it reminded me that my children were watching, that my silence wasn't just hurting me, it was shaping them. One Sunday, Reuben preached about the Proverbs 31 woman. He described her as noble, strong, and submissive. He looked at me while he spoke, and the congregation followed his gaze. Everyone smiled at me, nodded. Afterward, they came to congratulate me. "You're the example we all look up to." I went home and vomited, because I had become a symbol of something I hated, because I knew that while they praised me, my reality was rotting behind closed doors. But the worst part wasn't the bruises. It wasn't the insults. It wasn't even the fear. It was the betrayal of the church, the institution that claimed to represent Christ, the community that preached compassion, but practiced complicity. And deep down, I still loved God. I just didn't know if He still loved me, because I had been told that to be a woman of faith, you must carry your cross, and I believed it. But no one ever said that your cross could crush your soul. Silence doesn't arrive like a scream. It arrives like fog. First, it wraps itself around your ankles. You keep walking. You pretend it's nothing. Then it rises to your knees, to your chest, until it fills your lungs, until breathing becomes a memory. That's how my silence felt. People often think that abuse is only bruises, only raised voices, only broken dishes, or hospital visits. But there's a kind of abuse that leaves no visible mark, yet it corrodes every cell of your being. Reuben had stopped hitting me years before. He no longer needed to. He had already won. He had broken me without breaking my bones. He used to say, "A true woman of God doesn't argue. She prays. A faithful wife doesn't complain. She surrenders." And I believed it. I didn't question anymore. I just obeyed. But inside, I was disappearing. I would go days without looking at myself in the mirror. Not because I feared what I'd see, but because I feared I'd see nothing. I didn't exist. I functioned. I cooked, cleaned, ministered, served. I made lists. I prayed over meals. I wrote devotionals. But my soul, it was somewhere else one day. I forgot the name of a sister from church. She had been attending for 5 years. We had shared meals. She had confided in me. But when I saw her after service, I couldn't recall her name. Not even her husband's name. Nothing. My mind was blank. It scared me, because it wasn't old age. I was only in my 40s. It was trauma. It was years of suppression, of mental contortion, of bending myself so far to fit Reuben's mold that I no longer knew who I was. I started losing weight, not because I wanted to, because I couldn't eat. My stomach rejected food. My body knew something was wrong, even if my mind kept pretending. Magdalena noticed. She was a teenager by then, beautiful, smart, too perceptive for her age. She came to me one afternoon, closed the door to the kitchen, and said, "Mom, are you okay?" I forced a smile, said yes. She didn't believe me. She reached out and touched my hand. "You can talk to me, you know." And I wanted to. God knows. I wanted to open my heart, to let it all pour out, to tell her everything. But I couldn't, because I didn't want to shatter her faith. I didn't want to destroy her father in her eyes. I didn't want to burden her with a truth too heavy for her young soul. So I lied. I said I was tired, that menopause was tough, that I was fine, and she nodded, but her eyes filled with tears. That night, I wept, because I had become the thing I feared most, a liar in the name of love. My body kept reacting. My hair fell out in patches. I had dizzy spells. My hands trembled. When I held a cup, I went to a doctor. He said it was stress. I almost laughed, because I knew it wasn't stress. It was captivity. I was a prisoner in a golden cage, a respected, admired, praised prisoner. And the worst part, I had the key. I could have walked away, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know how to start over. I didn't know who I was without the title pastor's wife. My faith was eroded, not because I didn't believe in God, but because I no longer believed He believed in me. I would sit in the pews and listen to Reuben preach about grace, about freedom, about the joy of the Lord, and I felt nothing, no joy, no freedom, no grace, only a void, so vast, so deep, I feared it would swallow me. I started writing letters to myself, late at night, with trembling hands. I wrote things I couldn't say aloud, letters like, "Dear Helena, you are not crazy, you are not weak, you are not unworthy, you are tired, you are hurt, but you are still alive." I never shared those letters, but I think they saved me, because in them I remembered who I was before Reuben, before the church, before the silence. I was a girl who loved music, who wanted to travel, who laughed loudly, who dreamed of being a teacher. And I promised myself, if I ever got out, I would find that girl again. But promises made in the dark often fade with the sun, and every morning I'd wake up and forget the letter, forget the promise, forget myself, until one afternoon Samuel came home with a drawing. It was a picture of our family. He had drawn Reuben tall and angry, himself tiny and sad, me without a mouth. When I asked him why, he said, "Because you never talk, Mom. That broke me. Not the silence, not the abuse, not the church. That because I realized that my silence wasn't noble. It was destructive, and it was infecting my children." That night, I looked in the mirror again, and for the first time in years, I saw something, not beauty, not strength, not even clarity, but a spark, small, flickering, but there, and I knew I had to protect it, because that spark might just be my last chance to find the fire again. I used to say I loved him. I used to whisper it after service, after a shared meal, after a gentle moment that came once in a blue moon. And I'd hold on to that sliver of tenderness as if it erased everything else. But what I called love was fear. It wasn't affection. It was conditioning. It wasn't trust. It was survival. One day, I read a passage in a devotional that said, "Perfect love casts out fear." I reread it 10 times, and I finally asked myself, if I'm afraid of him, how can this be love? That question was the first crack in the dam. Reuben had always used scripture as a weapon, but I had started reading the Bible alone again, in secret, not the highlighted verses he had trained me to memorize, not the wise submit ones. I started with the Gospels, with Jesus, not Paul, not Leviticus, not Timothy, just Jesus. And what I saw in him was not control, not domination, not silence. He listened to women. He defended them. He healed them. He saw them. And I wept because I realized I had followed a distorted image of God my entire life. I had submitted to Reuben, thinking I was submitting to the Lord. But God was never in his fists, never in his threats, never in his icy stares. I wish I could say I left him right then, that I packed my things and walked away. But I didn't, because fear doesn't let go just because truth knocks. It takes time. It takes strength. And I had neither. I still had children at home. Magdalena was preparing to go to college. Samuel was only 10, and I was terrified of destroying what little stability they had. So I stayed, but I changed. Quietly, subtly, I stopped flinching when he raised his voice. I stopped apologizing when I hadn't done anything wrong. I stopped quoting his favorite verses back to him. And most of all, I started writing again. Not just letters to myself, but prayers, honest ones. God, I don't know who I am. I don't know what love is. I don't know what safety feels like, but I want to learn. Those prayers were clumsy, raw, messy, but they were mine. For the first time in decades, I stopped pretending in front of God, and something shifted. Reuben noticed. He said I was becoming rebellious, that I was being influenced by the world, that feminism had crept into my spirit. But I didn't argue, because I knew he no longer had my soul, only my presence. He tried harder to control me. He corrected me more often, in front of the children. He demanded I stop attending the women's Bible study at another church. He accused me of flirting with other pastors. He once even said, "If you ever leave me, I'll make sure no one believes you." And I believed him, because the church was still on his side, because image was more powerful than truth. Still, I kept changing. I started journaling my memories, writing about my childhood, my dreams before marriage, my favorite smells, my favorite books, my secret desires, and I began to see myself not as a wife, but as a woman who had lived too long in someone else's script, a woman who had performed for decades and was finally stepping off the stage. Samuel, my youngest, began to notice. He came to me one evening, held my hand, and said, "You look different, Mom." I asked, "Is that good or bad?" He smiled. "It's good. You look like you." Those words stayed with me, because I didn't even know what me meant anymore. But if he saw her, maybe she still existed. Magdalena returned home from college one weekend. She had become more vocal, more independent. She brought a book titled "When Love Hurts," left it on my nightstand without a word. I read it into nights, and for the first time, I saw my life reflected in another woman's story. It felt like a mirror, like validation, like the heavens whispering, "You're not crazy." I started planning, not escape, not yet, but boundaries. I said no to Reuben for the first time in years. He wanted me to organize a conference. I refused. He exploded, but I didn't flinch. He said I was dishonoring his ministry. I said, "You dishonored it long before I stopped covering for you." That night, he didn't speak to me for 2 days. It was the most peaceful 2 days I had in decades. I realized something important then. Sometimes the punishment they threaten us with is better than the life they offer. I began saving money in secret, little by little, from groceries, from gifts, from selling crafts anonymously at the market. I didn't know when I'd use it, but it felt like power, like a seed. I also began reaching out to old friends, quietly, women who had disappeared from church, women who had stopped coming without explanation. And what I found shocked me. So many of them had stories like mine, some worse, some different, but all of them had been silenced by the same message: stay, God will fix it. But what if God was waiting for us to move first? What if deliverance looked like walking away? I didn't have all the answers, still don't. But I knew I couldn't die in that house. Not physically, spiritually, because I had already died once. And now I wanted to live, really live, not for Reuben, not for appearances, not even for my children, but for me, and that was the most terrifying, most holy thing I had ever decided. I always thought choosing yourself was selfish. That putting your needs first meant you were weak, carnal, disobedient to God. That's what Reuben always said. He preached it. He lived it. He drilled it into me. A woman who thinks of herself, he said, was out of order, worldly, rebellious, dangerous. But the truth is, there comes a moment when choosing yourself is the only holy thing left to do. That moment came quietly for me. No thunder, no big fight, no final slap, just a whisper from within. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary. I was folding laundry in the bedroom. The window was open. A breeze came in, soft and warm. Samuel was doing homework at the kitchen table. Reuben was out, probably at the church office. I picked up one of Samuel's shirts. It still smelled of soap and sunshine, and I began to cry. Not sobs, not pain, just tears. Because in that moment, I realized I wanted to live, not just survive, not just serve, not just be a wife, a mother, a shadow, but live. I wanted to wake up in the morning without fear. I wanted to eat without a knot in my stomach. I wanted to sing again, laugh again, look at myself and not feel shame. I placed the shirt down, went to the mirror, and looked myself in the eyes. I whispered, "You don't deserve this." And for the first time, I believed it. It sounds small, insignificant, but for someone who's been told every day that they're worthless, that moment is revolutionary. I stood there, examining the lines on my face, the gray in my hair, the sadness in my eyes, and I said it again, "You don't deserve this." That night, I wrote in my journal, "I'm still here, I'm still breathing, and I'm not leaving this earth without knowing what it means to be free." From that day on, something in me shifted. I didn't tell anyone, not yet, but I moved differently. I stopped rushing to meet Reuben's every demand. I let the phone ring. I let the house be messy. I let the silence speak. He noticed. "What's wrong with you lately?" he asked. I shrugged. He didn't like that. He needed control. He fed on obedience. But I had tasted something else now. Not rebellion, not pride, dignity. I began to reread the Gospels. I focused on the women. The woman at the well, the one with the issue of blood, the adulterous woman, Mary Magdalene. Each of them had been judged, rejected, silenced. But Jesus, he never condemned them, never called them liars, never demanded their silence. He lifted them. He spoke to them. He saw them. And that's when I knew, if Jesus saw them, he must see me, too. Even if the church didn't, even if Reuben didn't, even if I had stopped seeing myself, I began to dream again. Not big things, not escapes, just simple things. A small house, a garden, a chair by the window, a quiet space where no one yelled. Sometimes I'd sketch it out, draw little maps. Magdalena saw one of my drawings one day. She looked at it and asked, "What's this?" I hesitated. Then I said, "It's my dream." She smiled. "I hope you make it real, Mom." That shook me, because for years I thought my dreams were dead, that motherhood had buried them, that marriage had erased them, but they were there, just dormant, and every day that I chose myself, they stirred. I started saying no more often, to church events, to Reuben's last-minute demands, to guilt. One evening, we had guests over. Reuben made a comment about how I was not as submissive as I used to be. Everyone laughed, but I didn't. I looked at him and said, "Maybe I finally learned to submit to God instead." The room went quiet. He glared, but I didn't care, because for once I had spoken truth. I began saving again, more intentionally. I found a friend who owned a little shop and began helping her on weekends. Reuben thought I was leading a prayer group. I was building my lifeboat. One day, as I left the shop, the owner, Teresa, pulled me aside. She said, "Helena, if you ever need a place to go, my doors open. I thanked her, held back tears, and walked away. That night, I wrote, "There are angels who wear aprons instead of wings." And I realized that God hadn't abandoned me. He had just been waiting for me to open the door. Even the kids changed. They noticed I laughed more, that I wasn't as tense, that I started humming again while cooking. Samuel once said, "I like this version of you, Mom." I hugged him and whispered, "Me too." That's when I knew I hadn't died. I had just gone quiet. And now I was waking up. I didn't have a full plan yet, but I had a decision. I was no longer going to die in silence. I was going to live, even if it was just one brave breath at a time. And if you're listening to this story now, if you've made it this far, then I need to ask you something. Please comment below with the words, "I choose myself." Let that be your vow. Like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel, because stories like mine are real, and they deserve to be heard. Let's stop dying in silence. Let's start living together. People think freedom comes with a shout, with a door slammed shut, with luggage rolling down the stairs. But for me, freedom started in a whisper. It was a Sunday morning. Reuben was preparing for the service. His sermon was titled, "The Obedient Wife, a Crown to Her Husband." I had heard him preach it 3 times before. Same verses, same tone, same audience nodding in agreement. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, "I won't go." It felt small, insignificant, but it was everything, because until that moment, I had never refused to attend. Even with bruises, even with fever, even with heartbreak, I had always gone. This time, I stayed. Reuben was furious. "What do you mean you're not coming?" I didn't answer. He threw his Bible on the bed, the same Bible he used to justify my silence. He stared at me with those eyes that once made me shrink, but I didn't move. He picked up his keys, slammed the door, and left. The house became quiet, almost sacred. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and breathed. For the first time in years, I wasn't pretending. That morning, I opened my journal and wrote, "This is the beginning. I may not know the ending, but I know I cannot stay." I called Teresa. "Is your offer still open?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, always." I didn't leave that day. Not yet. But the seed had taken root. That week, I started packing little by little, only what mattered. My journal, photos of my children, a small cross my mother had given me, 2 changes of clothes. I didn't tell anyone, not Magdalena, not Samuel, not because I didn't trust them, but because I needed to trust myself first. One night, while Reuben was asleep, I crept into the living room and prayed. I didn't use church words. I didn't perform. I just said, God, if you want me to stay, give me strength. If you want me to go, open the door wide. That night, I dreamt of a bird in a cage. The door was open, but the bird didn't fly. It looked at the sky. It looked back at the cage, and it waited. I woke up trembling because I was the bird, and the sky was waiting. The next morning, Reuben was softer, more polite. He brought me tea, asked if I wanted anything from the market. He sensed something was shifting. Abusers always do. They can smell the courage rising. But it was too late. I wasn't scared of his kindness anymore, because I knew it was a tactic, a rope disguised as ribbon. 2 days later, I packed my small bag, waited for Reuben to leave for a church visit, told Samuel I was going to see a friend, and I walked out the front door without looking back. Teresa welcomed me with a tight hug, no questions, just warmth. Her house was small, 1 bedroom, a couch, but it felt like heaven. I sat down, looked around, and cried, not from fear, not from sadness, from relief. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. That night, I slept without jumping at every sound, without waiting for the door to open in anger, without pretending. Just me under a blanket, breathing like a free woman. The next morning, Teresa handed me coffee and said, "You're safe now." I nodded, but deep down, I knew the real journey had just begun. Because freedom isn't just leaving, it's rebuilding, it's a learning, it's forgiving yourself for staying so long. I spent days crying, not just for the abuse, but for the girl I used to be. I missed her. I mourned her, but I also promised her, we're going to live now, for real. I called Magdalena and told her the truth. There was a long silence. Then she said, "Mom, I always knew something was wrong. I just didn't know how to help." We cried together, for everything, for nothing. She said she was proud of me, that she loved me, and that was enough. Samuel took it harder. He was confused, angry, torn between 2 worlds. I didn't blame him. Children love their parents, even when they hurt them. But I knew time would help, love would help. I just had to be patient. Teresa helped me get part-time work. I cleaned houses. I cooked for neighbors. I sold homemade bread at the market. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. And every peso I earned felt like a piece of myself coming back. Reuben tried to contact me. He sent church members. He left notes at Teresa's door. He called from blocked numbers, but I didn't respond because I had already answered with my silence, with my absence. I wasn't his anymore. One day, I saw a photo of myself from years ago, before the marriage, before the ministry, before the silence. And I realized she's not gone. She's just been waiting for this for me to come back, and I did, step by step, day by day, choosing myself, choosing truth, choosing life. Freedom has a price. No one tells you that. They only show you the moment of escape, the suitcase, the tears, the open door, but they don't talk about what comes after, the loneliness, the guilt, the echo of old lies whispering in your ear when the night is too quiet. At Teresa's house, I finally had peace, but I also had silence, and in that silence, memories came back like ghosts. I would wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to hear Reuben's footsteps. My body still braced for his voice. My heart still raced at the sound of keys in a door, even if they weren't his. It's strange how the body remembers. Abuse long after the bruises are gone. I couldn't sit at a dinner table without hearing his corrections in my mind. I couldn't open a Bible without feeling the weight of his twisted sermons. I couldn't look in the mirror without hearing him say, "You're lucky I put up with you." I knew I was free, but I didn't feel it yet. That's the part no one talks about. That freedom isn't a feeling, it's a decision, made over and over again, even when you don't feel worthy of it. I began therapy. At first, I didn't want to. I thought prayer would be enough, that God would heal me if I just had more faith. But Teresa insisted, and deep down, I knew she was right. My therapist, Lorena, was gentle. She didn't ask too much at first, just listened. She let me unravel, slowly, like a tangled thread that hadn't been touched in years. One day, she asked, "When was the first time you believed you didn't matter?" I didn't have to think. "When I was 5, I said. My father had yelled at me for breaking a glass, called me useless, said I'd never amount to anything. And my mother, she stayed silent. That's when the seed was planted, a seed that told me I was less, unworthy, disposable, and every man after him just watered it. Reuben didn't create my wounds. He found them ready and deep and made them his pulpit. Healing wasn't easy. It meant sitting with my younger self, the little girl who used to dream of being a teacher, who loved singing in the kitchen, who believed in fairy tales. I wrote letters to her, held imaginary conversations. I told her she didn't deserve what happened, that she mattered, that I was sorry for abandoning her all those years. And slowly, she began to smile again. Not in real life, but inside me. Samuel visited me one weekend. He was older now, more thoughtful. He hugged me tight, held my hands, and said, "Mom, I didn't understand why you left, but now I think I do." That broke me. I wept in his arms like a child, because for years I had carried the guilt of breaking my family. But in truth, I was saving it. I was showing my son that love does not hurt, that silence is not strength, that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. He stayed the weekend. We cooked together, watched old movies, laughed at nothing, and for the first time, I saw him not just as my son, but as a young man learning what kind of man he wanted to be. And I hoped, with all my soul, that he would never raise his voice at a woman, never confuse control with love. Magdalena called often. She invited me to her graduation. I hesitated. Reuben would be there. She knew it. And she said, "I want you there, even if he is too." So I went. I dressed simply, hair pulled back, cross around my neck. When I walked in, I felt every eye on me. Some people whispered, others avoided me. But Magdalena ran into my arms. "You came." She whispered, "Always," I said. Reuben stood across the room, staring. He didn't approach, didn't speak. And for the first time, I didn't care, because I wasn't there to confront him. I was there to celebrate my daughter, to show her I was still her mother, stronger now, wiser. After the ceremony, Magdalena said, "Mom, you look happy," and I realized I was not all the time, not perfectly, but enough. I went home that night and wrote, "Happiness is not a destination. It's a whisper that grows louder each time you choose yourself again." I still had bad days. Days when memories came like waves. When I missed the idea of love. When I wondered what my life could have been if I had left earlier. But then I remembered. Freedom isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future that doesn't repeat it. I started speaking in support groups, quietly, anonymously at first, sharing my story, not because I wanted sympathy, but because I wanted other women to know, you're not alone, and you're not crazy. I met women just like me, old, young, rich, poor, churchgoers, atheists. Pain didn't discriminate, but healing came in community. One woman said, "Hearing your story gave me the courage to leave, and that made every tear worth it. Because if my pain could save someone else, then maybe it had a purpose after all." It took me 8 decades to realize something that should have been obvious. I was never born to apologize for my existence, but for most of my life, that's exactly what I did. In every glance, every quiet nod, every lowered voice, every forced smile, I apologized when I spoke too loud, when I cried, when I wanted things, when I asked for space, when I didn't agree, when I simply took up room. It had become instinct. Breathing came second to saying I'm sorry. But something shifted the day I looked into the mirror and no longer saw a woman broken. I saw a survivor. And survivors don't apologize for surviving. That day, I sat by the window at Teresa's house, now my house, and opened a new journal. I wrote on the first page, "My life is not an apology. It's a declaration." And I meant it. That week, I made decisions I would have never dared to before. I painted the living room yellow, my favorite color. I started wearing red lipstick. Again, the shade Reuben used to say was too bold for a godly woman. I laughed loudly in public. I danced while cleaning. I told people no without explaining why. I stopped shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never built for my full self. It wasn't always easy. The guilt still came like a shadow sometimes, when I bought something for myself, when I rested, when I chose joy. But I reminded myself, you don't owe anyone suffering to prove your worth. One afternoon, Teresa and I were sitting in the garden. She looked at me and said, "You smile differently now." I asked her what she meant. Before, your smile was a survival mask. Now, it's real. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled, real, authentic, unapologetic. Samuel came to visit again. He had matured. His eyes carried depth. He brought me a letter. It was from Reuben. I hesitated before opening it. Inside, he had written, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know, I see now what I did. I see you, and I'm sorry. I didn't cry, not out of coldness, but because I no longer needed his validation to feel whole." I placed the letter in a drawer, not to treasure, not to frame, but to remind myself that people can change. But that doesn't mean you need to let them back into your life. Forgiveness, I learned, is not always reconciliation. Sometimes it's simply freedom from carrying what no longer belongs to you. I began volunteering at a local women's shelter. I listened more than I spoke, because I knew what silence looked like. I knew the language of downcast eyes and nervous hands. One girl, only 17, said, "I feel like I'm too broken to start over." I held her hand and whispered, "So did I, but look at me now." She wept in my arms, and I felt a full circle healing, like every tear I had shed had become a river others could drink from. I started writing my story, not for fame, not for revenge, but because stories save lives, and I wanted mine to be a lighthouse for women still lost in the storm. One morning, I stood in front of a group of teenage girls and told them, "Your worth is not determined by who loves you. It's not measured by your obedience. You are valuable simply because you are." They clapped, some cried, some just stared, and I knew I had planted a seed. I received a call from Magdalena. She was expecting her first child. "Mom, I want you to be there, in the delivery room. I want my daughter to meet the bravest woman I know." I packed my things and traveled to be by her side. The moment I held that baby girl in my arms, I made her a silent promise. You will never be taught to apologize for existing. I kissed her tiny forehead. She opened her eyes and stared at me, wide, curious, alive. In that moment, I understood legacy, not buildings, not wealth, but freedom passed down like an heirloom. I told Magdalena, she will know who she is, because you do, and because I finally do, too. That night, I lay in the guest room, thinking of the girl I used to be, so small, so scared, so desperate to be loved. I closed my eyes and whispered, "We made it," and I meant it. Not perfectly, not without scars, but we made it. And if you've listened to this story until now, if something in your heart stirred as you heard my words, then please write in the comments, "I exist without apology." Say it out loud. Let it echo. Let it heal. It took a lifetime, a full, aching, bleeding lifetime. But I finally learned to live without fear. Not because the world became safer, not because the past stopped haunting me, but because I decided fear would no longer be the compass guiding my steps. I remember the first time I walked through a crowd without flinching. It was market day. The street was noisy, full of voices, smells, color. Once, that would have overwhelmed me. I would have looked down, stayed quiet, prayed not to be seen. But that day, I looked up. I let the sun warm my face. I smiled at strangers. I even stopped to buy earrings from a vendor, silver ones, with tiny birds. When I put them on, the vendor said, "You look free." And I replied, "I am. Living without fear doesn't mean I never feel afraid. It means I no longer surrender to it. It means when the memories come, and they do, I hold space for them. But I don't let them own me. I talk to them like old ghosts. Yes, I remember you, but I no longer belong to you. I began to travel, not far, just enough. I visited the ocean, let the waves kiss my feet, watched children build castles in the sand, and I thought of the girl I used to be, building castles out of silence, out of shame. I returned to my hometown once, the one I had left behind with so many scars. The church was still there, same doors, same pulpit, different pastor. I walked, enduring an afternoon prayer, not to relive anything, but to reclaim myself. I sat in the back pew and whispered, "I survived this. I outlived what tried to break me." And with that, I stood up and walked out, not in bitterness, in peace. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from overcoming. Magdalena's daughter is for now. She calls me Abuelita Soul, because I always wear yellow, because she says I'm bright. I laugh every time she says it, because she doesn't know how long it took for me to believe I had light in me. Every Friday, we bake cookies together. She tells me her dreams. And I listen like her voice is sacred, because it is. All girls' voices are, and none of them should ever be silenced. I've written a book, not for the shelves, for the women, those in shelters, in churches, in kitchens, in silence. It's called The Woman Who Learned to Breathe Again. It's my gift to the world, because breathing, truly breathing, after years of holding it in, is a revolution. Every page is a step, every word a door opening. I included a letter at the end. It says, to the woman reading this in secret, you are not what happened to you. You are not the lies they told you. You are not weak for staying. You were surviving. But now, if you can, choose life, choose voice, choose yourself. I did. And so can you. Sometimes I still sit by the window, a cup of tea, a soft breeze, and I think, this is enough, not in a settling way, but in a full way. I don't need to prove anything anymore, not my worth, not my strength, not my faith. I simply am, and that is holy to anyone watching this story, to anyone who's followed me through every shadow and sunrise. Thank you. Thank you for witnessing my truth, for honoring my scars, for holding space for this old woman who once was a scared girl in the corner of a kitchen. If you made it to the end, I want to ask you something, not for me, for yourself. Write in the comments, I choose to live without fear. Let those words be your banner, your turning point, your beginning. Like this video if it touched your heart. Share it with someone who needs a hand to hold in the dark. And subscribe to this channel, because we are building a community of truth tellers, survivors, and light bearers. You are not alone, and if no one has told you today, you are worthy, you are loved, you are seen. Now, go live loudly, fully, freely, because life is too short to apologize for your voice, and far too sacred to be lived in silence.